Hey Peter, well it's that time of year again. We're all about to take a couple of weeks off, and I thought it'd be some good reading time. I've definitely got a few books that I'm going to get through, but I thought I'd make some recommendations for anybody that was thinking about picking up a boxing book over Christmas. And these, there's nothing. These are just personal favourites, so I just sort of hooked off the shelf, and I thought I'd talk about them for a few minutes. So the first one is War Baby. Kevin Mitchell's book, which it details the fight between Gerald McClellan and Nigel Benn in 1995. An absolutely fascinating book. It traces the history of both fighters, how they got to that fight and how they got through that amazing 10 rounds. And obviously we know the tragic result of McClellan going down in the 10th and never really getting up. And, it traces, it's a lot about the boxing business. It's a lot about those two fighters. And, in their histories, you can kind of see how those histories came out in the fight. The way McClellan had recently sacked his trainer, Emmanuel Stewart, and drafted in someone himself. I mean, that was kind of his character. There is the controversial bits in it about McClellan's love of dogfighting, and also how Ben was able to tough out the first few rounds of that fight and eventually come out victorious. There's a lot of his story in there as well. So an absolutely fascinating book. Just dissecting one fight, tracing the fighters through through the build up and through the fight, and really well written, beautiful talk book. Not very long, so a real good one you can read in a day or so. And another book on another fight, The Fight by Norman Mailer. So we're getting into sort of classic literature territory here. This is really sort of Mailer's attempt to ape Hemingway, writing about great sporting events. And, it is a fascinating book. Again, it does trace both fighters, in the run up to Zaire, what they meant, the sort of socio-political elements of the fight, what it represented, and this huge clash of two, huge men, but huge egos, huge will to wins and all that sort of thing coming out in Zaire. And also it traces what a strange place Zaire was to have the fight. Mobutu Zaire, a despotic dictator who was kind of trying to sort of sports wash, as we now call it, his country. And how that all played out, and the sort of brutality of the Mobutu regime, comes out very well in that book. But real fascinating read, about those fighters. And as you'll guess, that's not the only Ali book we're going to look at today. So the next one is Bouts of Mania. In a way, another book I haven't got here, David Remnick's King of the World, is a fascinating prelude to this book, because that kind of traces Ali, his development for the Olympics until his second fight with Liston. And that book, David Remnick's King of the World, kind of outlines I suppose, the contemporaries that Ali had to overcome at that time. So you had Floyd Patterson and Sonny Liston, who were passing the title between them. Floyd Patterson was kind of seen as, in a way, the good Negro. He behaved very well, was very sort of, the public persona was very sort of nice and well kept and well spoken. And then you had Sonny Liston, who was kind of the classic bad Negro in a way, had come out of prison and was very sullen and all that sort of thing, didn't say a lot. And then, of course, you had Ali came along and just shattered those two stereotypes. As Ali himself said, he had to become a new kind of black man, a new kind of person to sort of help people and move things on. And so it's about the sort of social stereotypes of the time, and of other things they were fighting against outside the ring, as well as each other. Again, potted biography. Now this one, Bouts of Mania, again is a kind of socio-political look through the lens of the boxing ring, but this time obviously it's Foreman Fraser and Ali, and those fights. Around the globe, through a rumble of the jungle, all that sort of thing. So like potted histories of those fights, histories of those fighters, and also looking at how America, with the backdrop of Watergate and Vietnam, was looking at these fights, I hesitate to say light relief, but as relief from almost this sort of disintegration of all the horrible stuff that was going on, and what these fighters came to exemplify. So this, Bouts of Mania, again, another fascinating book. And as I mentioned, David Remnick's King of the World is a good complementary book to it. Now, we're getting off Ali for a moment. Fighting Men of London. This is a real favourite of mine. And I don't think, many people have got this. It's not very widely read. It traces 7 fighters who plied their trade between the 1930s and 1960s. And it really conjures up a lost world. Obviously, I've got a very personal affiliation to this. I spent a long time living in the East End, just around the corner from York Hall, and so I recognise a lot of these places. But this is a lost world of obviously you had the Ring, you had as venues, you had Wonderland, you had various other venues around East London, and well, obviously the Ring was in Southwark, where these men plied their trade. And it's amazing again to read about how frequently they fought, how often they fought, how long they fought, how they trained as well. Just seems bizarre to us nowadays. Making weight by wandering around sucking on a penny. That was one of the tricks to just sort of keep them sort of salivated a bit, because they were intensely dehydrated by today's standards. But a fascinating book about about London, about the history of boxing, about these boxers, and really amazing characters, all of them. Well worth a read. Again, not a very long book. Now, back to Ali. He does dominate the books, doesn't he? Blood Brothers, the story of the relationship between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. I don't know how many people know about this. Obviously, anybody that's now the aficionado will know that he was very heavily influenced by Malcolm X. In the run-up to, after the Olympics and up until and just after he won the title, when they split because Malcolm fell out with the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, and Muhammad Ali decided to side with Elijah Muhammad and cut Malcolm X off, who was assassinated shortly afterwards in 1965. There's recently been a fascinating play called One Night in Miami, which details what happened in a hotel room with Jim Brown, Sam Cooke, Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X directly the night that he won the title from Liston. And it shows how close that relationship was. Although that play and the subsequent film is predominantly about in that relationship between Malcolm X and Sam Cooke, but they will, people will remember Sam Cooke jumping in the ring to congratulate Ali afterwards, and they all went off to this hotel room. But Blood Brothers tells the intimate story of the relationship between Ali and Malcolm, how close it was. Malcolm was almost like a father figure to Ali. He was considerably older, very much a father figure, influencing him and moulding him into what he would become, in the sense of the person we knew as Muhammad Ali. And it's interesting that later in life, Ali said, in all my life, I have one regret, one thing I wish I hadn't done, and that's it. And that thing is turning my back on Malcolm. That was wrong, and I wish I hadn't done it. So, a fascinating insight into that thought from Ali, into how close they were, and into the huge influence that Malcolm X was on who, what would become Muhammad Ali. So, we're not going to do any more Ali. The next one, Four Kings. So again, this is a fascinating book about, after Ali, there was a kind of moribund period in the 80s, understandably after that character left the stage, and that was filled, by Duran, Leonard, Hagler and Hearns, and their fights together, over those period of about 4 or 5 years. So a fascinating book, again, a little potted biography of each character, how they rubbed up against each other, what they kind of represented to people, how they intertwined, and why they became so iconic and featured in some of these many amazing fights that often go down as the greatest fights in history, in ways that we use as kind of yardsticks to measure excitement in fights, or different characters of fighters, or different styles of fighting, and how they all came up against each other. So the last one I'm going to review is a little bit more recent. We've reviewed this before, but Damaged by Tris Dixon, which just came out this year. If you're interested in boxing, this is worth a read. If you're involved in boxing, I think it should almost be compulsory to read this. It's about, it traces the history of what we used to call pugilistic dementia and what we now call CTE, chronic brain trauma, basically, and how that has manifested in boxing, how it's damaged boxing. It talks to a lot of fighters, traces the history of the understanding of this condition, talks to a lot of fighters, both journeymen and famous fighters who are suffering from it, and looks, more importantly, at ways that we can alleviate this, ways that we can stop it, obviously without damaging the sport. And I think this is so important because, Tris Dixon, for want of a better phrase, is one of us. He's a real boxing aficionado. He was editor of Boxing News. He writes for various publications, and he's quite influential within the sport. So he writes from a great love of boxing. Although he has to sort of look at this that a lot of people don't want to talk about, and how we can address it and how we need to address it. And I think it's important that boxing addresses this itself. And owns it, rather than eventually somebody will come knocking on the door. As all the other sports are trying to get their house in order with this sort of thing, then boxing needs to as well. So that's well worth a read. Just some light reading for Christmas, Peter, and I hope you will read through those if you haven't, no doubt, already. And I'm going to take a couple of weeks off, get out of the gym, and read a lot of books myself, and going to enjoy that. But really looking forward to be back in January. I think it's going to be a fascinating year in boxing. There is so much going on. Maybe we'll get some resolution at the top of the heavyweight tree, but there's loads going on without that anyway, so it's going to be absolutely fascinating, and I can't wait for January and to get back to the fights. Thanks very much, Peter. Have a great Christmas, and I'll see you soon.